So Nathaniel's one of our newest members. Nathanael Downes is a recent University of Michigan grad with a PhD in materials chemistry. And he's going to briefly discuss what he perceives to be essential issues in the expansion of grid scale renewable energy. He also has a PhD project that someday would be really fun to hear about. As I keep thinking Craig would love to talk to him about it. So anyway, Nathanael, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. Let me see if I can share. So I just made a couple slides real quick. Let's see if I can go. And you guys can see this presenter mode, right?
You bet.
Okay, cool. So in general, the idea that I've been really kind of grappling with for a while is this transition away from this fossil fuel-based globe to, say, one that uses primarily renewables, such as photovoltaics, like silicon, so solar cells. Now, up front, there is a visible cost that you could convert in terms of the power efficiency, right? So when you're using fossil fuel, it's remarkably cheaper than it is to use, say, a solar cell for a myriad of different reasons. But within that, if you want to think in more long-term, right, perspectives, when you factor in things like acid rain, right, the inevitable warming of the climate, right, the changes to our shorelines, you can make projected models for what, right, the true cost would be to power, given a useful source. So people have made these models using fossil fuels, but the same can't exactly be said for renewables in terms of their long-term problems. So the idea is really in the movement towards making total renewables, right, grid scale renewables, we should probably envisage some of what might be the hidden costs that exist there. So in general, there are a couple of different criteria that you would want to establish before you start thinking about a permanent renewable source. The first would be that what you can do is take ores commonly found in the earth and convert this to a material that would be useful for renewables. So if you took, right, different rare earth metals, you could make wind turbines hydrothermal systems. But in this case, we could consider just a solar cell, for instance, right? And in principle, you should be able to know how to do this extremely well, both in terms of its chemistry, the metallurgy, and the physics of that ultimate material. After this, you want to make sure that once you have your system up and running, it has a very long operational lifetime so that there's minimal maintenance required to work with it once it's installed. In other words, it just runs itself and it doesn't do so with much complication. You also want to be sure that whatever renewable that you do have ends up being relatively non-toxic should some catastrophic event occur, right? I mean, we could think about tornadoes that go through, right, tornado alleys, right, in the middle of the country, or even coastal regions that get swamped by hurricanes. And because of climate change, we know that these are increasingly, right, more prevalent. So you just want to ensure that whatever material you have that gets exposed doesn't poison people. And then lastly, you want to make sure that the manufacturer of whatever renewable you're looking at is not only simple so that it doesn't have to take place in very expensive facilities, but that also inexpensive, right? So it's basically a democratizable source of energy. Anybody in the world could make it. You don't have to buy it from a first world nation. So among all the different types of renewables that are probably the most prominent, the one to consider would really be solar cells, right? Because solar energy sort of undoubtedly has the highest potential for powering the globe. And right now, if we consider, these problems of cost, right? The most predominant form that's used for a solar cell is silicon in some manner or another, whether that be amorphous, single crystalline, or multi. The other ones like CIGS or cad telluride, or even these other crystalline products, like more exotic ones, those are not really useful for scale because of the toxicity reasons that we mentioned before, and also because of the expense. But a big problem with, say, just PV expansion using silicon on the whole is when you consider this cost, right, quotient, right? So ultimately, if you consider how much money does it take to make this material versus how much energy are we getting out, when we think about solar in particular, what we can say is that at this point with silicon, which is the most predominant form that we use right now, this bottom part of the quotient is pretty much ironed out. Basically, all of the chemistry, physics, and metallurgy of what could be used to give a higher power output, or for these materials is achieved. We've essentially reached the theoretical limits of what we could do to improve these systems. So in order to change this cost quotient, you would really need to change the actual manner, the manner of its manufacture. Because right now what we do is we take sand and we bring it through these melt processes and these multiple distillation steps that ultimately require not only huge facilities, but that have enormous power inputs and enormous polluting outputs. So in terms of the actual cost, this part is also relatively inflexible right now. And what's more is that even if you did want to make all of these solar cells, one of the big problems here is that it's the actual output of pollution that's required to even make 1 kilogram of a solar grade material, right? So ultimately, when you're making these, the time it takes for that solar cell to basically buy back all the expense in terms of its polluting costs and all of its energy inputs is pretty considerable. It's on the scale of years. And if you blow this out and you consider doing this for the entire globe, well, it seems like upfront you would end up polluting a substantial quantity, more than you would like to, right? In order to make this renewable source, a feasible method of powering the globe. So this is one form of the invisible costs, but there are additional problems that you could envisage that occur with renewables in general. And one example is the fact that one problem that we have, especially in the first world, is that we almost outsource all of our waste handling to third world nations, which more often than not, just ends up taking these limited quantity materials like that are critical to making boards and other electrical components, and they basically just accrue in dumps, getting burned or just saturating up different river systems. And on the whole, if we have some failure to our renewable sources, this is pretty much where they're going to go. So all of this material ends up getting spent and it's non-recyclable, at least at present. But this is one thing that could be changed. And the problem with this and why it's so considerable is that e-waste has a lot of different metals in it that will pollute various regions of the globe and create significant problems of environmental injustice that's almost entirely like asymmetrically suffered, right? Like it's almost always going to go to Southeast Asia or in various parts of Africa. And so these heavy metal contaminations have been well documented. They're highly enriched in different regions. And if we think about things like Flint water crisis being a big problem, well, I mean, if we blow out our e-waste problem, this would only become further exacerbated in time. An additional problem that you can consider here is that not only do we not really have the capacity to recycle e-waste at the moment, but one of the big problems is that the distribution of elements which are critical in order to make these materials is not equivalent in all different places. So the US government, actually any developed nation, has a list of what are called critical chemical commodities. And so what these describe are things like the cobalt or lithium, nickel, manganese. All of these are critical chemical commodities because we don't make much of them in the United States. We almost always have to import them. And specifically, things like lithium or rare earth materials are almost exclusively found or at least purchased by China at this point. So a lot of the cobalt that gets mined out, China has a large stake in this. So if you think about this from a national security perspective, if we end up shifting into a renewable energy sphere, well, we have to make sure that we have continued stores of these. And should any geopolitical tensions arise, it's possible that we might be at risk of exposure to our nation with limited energy supply as a consequence of our natural lack in these materials. So in sum, if we're thinking about renewable energy expansion, there are a couple things to consider. And the first is that the production of many of these materials is not environmentally benign as we think it is. It's sort of like plastic water bottles. You need thousands of uses out of them to actually make it environmentally equatable to just using paper or plastic cups that are single-use disposable. Secondly, the way that we deal with our e-waste is not really conducive to grid scale problems at this particular point in time, because we could very quickly run out of materials in order to further supply down the chain. And then lastly, as I mentioned, in terms of national security, it is a question of whether or not our energy economy will be stable because of our natural lack of abundance in certain minerals and materials. And so these are just a couple things to consider. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I guess I could keep the screen shared if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
Awesome. That was really interesting. I do have one question, and I think we have time for a few. When you talk about e-waste, are you mostly talking about after the lifetime of like solar cell, or are you talking about somehow during the processing or the manufacturing?
Yes. I mean, the aftermath. So what do we do with spent batteries, for instance?
Okay, so for all aspects of solar use, but after the lifetime.
This is, I mean, you could even consider like EV batteries, like our infrastructure to take old electric vehicle batteries, for instance, and reshare that is it's growing at present, but it's not substantial. So we would end up just basically wasting away tons of lithium and cobalt, which we don't readily have access to within our own nation.
Would it make sense to designate a landfill for e-waste that will eventually mine? And that would be better ore than rock ore?
Yeah, that's one way. There's a developing chain of companies that are interested in making what are called secondhand batteries, where they end up basically leaching out certain materials from old batteries and then putting them into new. But the problem that you often experience is contamination or crossover, which ends up lowering the efficiency of those batteries. But those are good questions. That's a good question. I think we should consider. I mean, what do we put it to one facility? I don't know. It's a good idea.
Nadine, you have your hand raised.
I just wanted to comment that, although I agree with a lot of what you say about, the strategic importance of lithium and rare earths. And I just wanted to point out that silicon is the most abundant,
Right.
Element. So that's a lucky thing. And also silicon is not toxic. And so, I think it's not, or I think silicon solar cells are not, as concerning to me as some other forms of electronic waste. I mean, I think like silicon, maybe some glass and plastic encapsulant and aluminum, but so just speaking out for silicon. I mean, and that's why I also worry when sometimes I see, public resistance to solar arrays, like, the sort of NIMBYism. We don't want solar arrays because, like, who knows what all those toxic things, we don't want them on our land, in our neighborhood. But really silicon, it's like glass, right?
Yeah.
So just wanted to make that distinction.
Yeah. The only problem with silicon, if we look back, if we kind of go to this chart, is that we can't make it simply and inexpensively.
Right. Yeah.
And it's extremely polluting.
Yeah. It takes a lot of energy to melt it, and it.
Yeah. I mean, and then in the regions in which it is produced in mass, it's extremely polluting. Like a lot of the smog that ends up happening in certain regions of China can almost be directly related to the solar manufacturing.
Yeah.
Barbara, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, Nathanael, you had mentioned your research to me at one point, or what it is you're doing in your job. I can't remember what it was, but it's something to do with solar, and you're quite excited about it. And so how does what you're doing through your research have to do with, these problems?
Yeah, so the big problem that I'm addressing, that I addressed with my PhD research, was essentially this diagram, right? We can make the selection that silicon, as Nadine had said, is It's non-toxic. It's really not that polluting. It lasts forever. And we also understand it very well, as I mentioned, in terms of these thermodynamic properties. But the thing that I was changing was the method of manufacture. So we had this idea that there's a necessary dogma that says that you have to do it by this particular route, which is called carbothermic reduction. But what I was doing was much more simple. It could be considered we could think about it as like a rock candy method. So I was able to grow crystalline silicon under ambient conditions. So in like the air basically breathed now, using only electricity. It worked to a very high degree. There's still a lot of ways to go in order to make it a pure solar cell or a functioning solar cell, just because the impurity content's high, but that's something that could be figured out in time. But I could talk more about that another time.
Great.
Cool.
Sounds helpful.
Craig, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, Nathaniel, first of all, that was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering about the efficiency of solar cells now. You say we're basically at the theoretical maximum, but my understanding is, for example, that single crystal solar cells can do better. And I'm wondering, the efficiency is not all that great as it is. So are we really at the point where thermodynamically we can't do any better?
Yeah, so you make a good point. If we look at the market share of solar cell based materials, a lot of it ends up going to multi-crystalline silicon. But with single crystalline silicon, where the defect concentration is very low, there's a term called the Shockley-Queessier limit, which basically just describes the absorption and emission efficiency of a photon, of a photon, and then transfer of an electron through the system. And for silicon, that has been ironed out. In very specific labs, under very specific settings, humankind knows how to do this. Whether or not you would commercialize a material and to do that is a separate question in and of itself, because really you want to drop this quotient as much as possible based on the cost. And so if you get it to its theoretical capacity, which we can do, that's just going to cost you a lot of money.
I see. Yeah. One other cost of inefficiency that you didn't mention, but I think is an important one, is simply the area coverage you have to devote to silicon, to solar cells. So if you can make them more efficient, you reduce that real estate that you need.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely the best way moving forward. But the only point I'm really trying to drive at is that there are things to consider before we dive headlong into things, I suppose.
Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you had data on, what the environmental impact of this is if we continue to create solar panels in this way, versus the environment and build out to what we need to build out and replace all the fossil fuels with solar, versus the environmental impact of if we just continue to use fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't personally have access to that data, but is a thought. If we consider 2020, right, when we all went into lockdown, you guys might remember that the electric vehicle supplies almost immediately diminished, right? Access to different computer parts immediately diminished, right? That's because the supply chain to actually manufacture solar or semiconductor grade silicon is pretty fickle. You need to buy well in advance, and it doesn't deal well with large unexpected orders. So actually making I'm sort of thinking about this, right? Expanding that particular industry to supply panels for the globe is probably a much more challenging feat than we're giving credit to upfront. I don't know if we actually have the facilities globally to start churning that out at a very high rate. But even if we did, we could just look at though I don't know what the projected issues would be, or like what the projected consequences would be if we supplied grid scale. Just looking at the consequences of what's happened even just now, it's pretty clear that it would be pretty detrimental.
I think oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I realize that other folks have their hands up, so.
I was going to call on Larry, and then after Larry's question, move on to the rest of our meeting, and hopefully we can have time for a continued discussion with Nathanael at a later time. But go ahead, Larry.
Hi, Nathanael. Thank you for an excellent talk. I think of our energy future being largely a three-way trade-off among conservation, solar, and wind. So my question is, how is wind energy as far as its production of toxins, and should we be emphasizing it a bit more?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, that's a bit, I don't know, but I'd love to find out too. I mostly am familiar with the literature on solar in particular, but wind is a bit of a black box for me in terms of its production issues. I will say that what I do know is that the turbines that are used are mostly rare earth. So, but they're in such low quantities. I don't really think that there's a big toxicity issue.